So, good, we're recording. Here's part 2. All right, so let's do one thing. I'm going to have to edit this. Yes, we're in frame. We're going to edit this. There is a way I can trim it. Okay, so what I wanted to pick up with, again, if you hopefully can, make sense of what it is I'm trying to do here. I want you to see that, again, in order to understand our government, you need to understand the framers. In order to understand the framers, you need to understand the events that shaped them. What we just looked at is the historic events, the kind of European events that led them to have an expanded expectation for a more absolute guarantee of these cornerstones. And again, these cornerstones we begin to view as part of the natural order of things that have been handed to you, and therefore you have an obligation not only to understand them, but to protect and preserve them. What we're going to see now is that their experiences in the colonies led to even greater expectations. And it has a lot to do with the British approach. The British basically kind of did things in a way that allowed us to even more freedom and therefore even more expectations. And that's what I'm going to lay out here again in a second. Again, just keep that idea in the back of your head. What we're trying to do is understand the engineers and what they intended by looking at all the things that influenced them, that informed them when they designed government. All right? So where we begin to kind of lay out the events that happened in the colonies, we start with the British and their expectations for their American colonies. And they're mixed motives. They have some political motives. They, again, the world and all the nations are kind of like a state of nature. There is no higher authority. And so if England is going to be secure, if France is going to be secure, if Spain is going to be secure, they need a proactive show of force. And what better proactive show of force than a colony? Shows how mighty you are and how powerful you are. So, and once you have one colony, you need another colony as a kind of a strategic base to protect that first colony. So there are political motives to establishing colonies and strategic motives. There's social motives. One of the best ways to handle dissent within your colony, to kind of handle people that have different religious and political viewpoints, is to send them elsewhere. Let them come to the Americas. They're still English citizens, but they're not creating the friction and tension in your own country. And if you've got prisoners, send them to Australia, right? This is a way to get rid of dissidents. But the primary motive to establishing a colony is economic. The colony is there to make you money. And the economic model that we're going to use to make money more specifically is the mercantile system, which I hope you're very familiar with. All the mercantile system is about is a balance of trade. You establish a colony as a way to get raw materials that you can then produce into finished goods and sell those finished goods, obviously to make your nation wealthy and profitable. What you're looking for mercantilism is, like I said, that balance of trade. You want, to concentrate wealth in gold, but in raw materials as well. And then, like I said, make finished goods and sell, to a global marketplace. When you look at the idea of being a colonist under this system, and keep in mind, mercantilism gets much more restrictive when we get to the Navigation and Staples Acts. They're going to kind of formalize mercantilism. They'll make rules about raw materials and finished goods. Right now, this is just kind of a guiding principle, but it's a restrictive one. It says that the colonies are there as a source of wealth, and they are there for the benefit of the mother country solely. That seems kind of restrictive, but keep in mind, from a colonist standpoint, this is still a pretty good deal. That in the colonies, you got a lot of freedoms. You have economic freedoms. The tax rate in England is 3 times higher than what it is in the colonies. you're going to see in a second a lot of political freedoms because there's not a lot of oversight. And you're certainly going to have a lot of religious freedoms, and I put that in quotes, in the sense that you're going to be able to find a colony where you are free to discriminate against others as you were discriminated against in England. In other words, I can go to Massachusetts and be a Protestant, be a Puritan, and I can discriminate against the Quakers. Or I can go to Maryland and I can be a Catholic. We don't have this universal sense of religious freedom, but you do have the idea of finding a colony that meets your religious ideas and being somewhat exclusive within that colony, but at least within the colony having religious freedom, right? So this is a pretty equitable arrangement for both sides. Colonies, again, are mostly there for economic purposes, that source of raw materials, and the colonists benefit with all these expanded freedoms. And this is the way we approached it initially for quite some time. Where's my dramatic click? More formally, when I say this relaxed approach, Britain had a formal approach. It's called salutary neglect. And you ought to understand what both parts of the word mean. If I say like greetings and salutations, that is me kind of saying hello, but wishing you well as I greet you, right? Neglect means to kind of leave alone. And these seem like, like an oxymoron, up escalator or down escalator, jumbo shrimp. We've got I can't wait to be alone together. We've got all these, words that sometimes don't go together, and this seems to be an oxymoron. How can I, neglect you? Neglect is bad, and yet have it be good. Well, I want you to think about like a helicopter parent, who, you're 16 and they're still following you up the slide to make sure you got a helmet on too, and they, a mouth guard, and they're trying to make sure I don't know why you're on the slide at age 16, but you've got a parent that you're trying to get away from, and they're following you up the slide. Someone hovering over you constantly, not allowing you any kind of autonomy can be a bad thing. And so philosophically, the idea is we're going to kind of leave the colonists alone to their own devices, and in doing so, they're going to learn from their experiences. They will take on the responsibilities of civilizing and developing, a new England within this uncharted wilderness. And it's going to be good for both sides. So this is a kind of a hands-off approach that's thought to be beneficial for both sides. Some of it, like I said, is the philosophical. This is a good approach, and our main concern is economic. We just want to make money. Let the colonists take on the risk and the responsibility for everything else. The other is the obvious pragmatic physical distance. The map doesn't look that far, but when you consider sailing in the 16, 17, even 1800s, we're talking a heck of a journey where it's anywhere from 8 to 12 weeks to get across the Atlantic. You hear those kids having fun? I want that to sink in. They're out there having fun. You're in here talking about salutary neglect. All apologies. I want you to picture that. Like, we got to build a road. Well, let's go check it with the king. 8 weeks, 12 weeks, and you get your answer about where to build the road. But in the meantime, the natives have taken it over. The physical distance makes salutary neglect a kind of a necessity. But what it's going to do is give you a tremendous amount of latitude. And we're going to see that in the charters as well. Basically, if all we're concerned with is the economics, and we're going to give you a wide kind of range of rights to run things yourself, you see that in the charters. Now, the charter is the legal document that the king gives you. If you want to start a colony, you got to get permission from the king. And what that permission will include is, here's where you can go, here's the land, here's kind of the basic organization of who can go. I'm going to authorize this trading company, I'm going to authorize this proprietor, this person I owe money and a favor to, and they're going to be the one in charge, or this religious group. So you authorize where you can go and the kind of the brief, the very loose structure of who's there and who's in charge. And you give them authorization to pursue trade. You give them essentially a monopoly on trade. And that's it. So there is no real other detail to the charter. So I want you to picture, class will start up in a little while. We're all pretending it's not going to. But you're in the first day of school, and the teacher starts with like 3 rules. It's, be on time, be nice, and do your best. I don't know. That seems like I've covered everything, isn't it? That should, if you follow those 3 rules alone, wouldn't that be just a high-functioning, successful classroom? Until one day I come in and you guys are in a massive desk fight. I mean, you're just hurling desks at each other with brute force, trying to just annihilate each other. And I lose my mind. I go, what are you doing throwing desks at each other? And you point out, well, we were here on time, Mr. Hastings. In fact, we got here early because we were excited about the desk fight. And we're being nice because we've all collectively agreed that this would be fun. And we're all having a blast throwing desks at each other. And we're doing our best. I'm really trying to throw this desk as hard as I possibly can. I'm using all my physical might to throw this desk at my classmate. You're following the 3 rules, right? But what you found is latitude. All right, longitude, latitude. Where's latitude? Give me my arms, right? Latitude, right? Latitude, flatitude. I'm going to spin the camera around and you're going to see all that puritanical shame, right? I feel shame. I was wrong. Latitude. In other words, what you did is you read between the lines and you stepped sideways around a rule. Get it? So with the charters, you've got all this room to kind of work around things. Now, eventually, if this was Mr. DeFranco and Mackenzie's back here, he would stress that different charters matter and that there's nuances to it. For AP Gov, we don't have to worry about it too much. Yes, there are different types of charters, and yes, they are eventually tightened up. They will eventually, as the colonists get out of line, will convert most of these charters to royal charters. And this is one of the dynamics that will set up the revolution, because what happens is within my division of power, within my separation of powers, I have an aristocratic governor appointed by the king and his council pitted against a democratically elected legislature, local assemblies. And those groups constantly clash, and that's one of the factors that will lead to revolution. But for our purposes right now, we can ignore these 2 adversarial groups and just understand in its infancy, mandated charters give us a lot of latitude. And with it, we created all these democratic institutions. Now, teachers have been droning on about the House of Burgesses, the Mayflower Compact, and the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut forever. And all you hear is Charlie Brown's teacher, the wah, 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 washing over you. Because these are, strange abstracts, and why should I think of them as important? What you need to understand about each of these is that these are democratic firsts. Nod your heads that you heard me, right? These are democratic firsts. And anytime you do something for the first time, it is oh so important because it sets a precedent. What is a precedent? What does it mean if you've set a precedent?
Set like an example.
You've done something for the first time and it sets the example. You've set the standard for any future event, right? We now have a bar to measure anything that happens afterwards. So these are all firsts that set a precedent in which we've claimed, it's an example where we can see we've claimed the democratic rights, and more importantly, we've gotten away with it. So the example it sets is that we can expect to self-govern and get away with it, right? What do we expect here with the House of Burgesses? Well, that's the first local legislative assembly. We've got Parliament. Parliament is a legitimate legislative body that represents us, but we want more local, direct representation, and we establish a precedent for it, and we expect it, therefore, in the future. With the Mayflower Compact, remember there was the Pilgrims aboard the Mayflower, and they get blown off course. They're supposed to be going to Virginia, and they end where? They land on what? Plymouth Rock. If you're a self-respecting New Englander, you know that, right? And you've been there. They land on Plymouth Rock. Okay, their charter is no longer valid. They had a permission slip that said you can go use the restroom, and you've decided you want to go get something from the vending machine. No bueno, right? Your permission slip does not give you authorization to go to the vending machine. What should you do? You're in the hallways. You go to that's because you're thinking like a true patriot, right? I'm going to do what I want. Freedom. But what should you do? You should go to the bathroom. If you want to go somewhere different, you go back. So hey, we landed in Plymouth. We're not supposed to be here. Let's go 12 weeks back to England and ask for a new permission slip. They're not going to do that. They think like you, Pip. Like I'm going to do what I want, right? They stayed and they self-authorized their own charter. I give myself permission to go to the vending machine and have as many delicious snacks as I want, right? They gave themselves permission to be there, and they agreed to a new structure that they were going to, collectively govern themselves. They were going to democratically kind of govern themselves through collective agreement. What's interesting again is this is hailed as this triumph of democracy. Remember, aboard the Mayflower, there were 202 people aboard the Mayflower, of which I want to say it's like 102 were pilgrims, and of which I want to say 66 were the male passengers that actually signed this document. And it was largely to keep everybody else in line. You know, those people that were the crew, we didn't want them going off in the woods, not living in the commons and doing weird things. Remember, we want to keep them living according to those puritanical values. So democracy goes slow. This is hailed as a democratic triumph. It's not purely democratic. But what it is self-authorized, that we can collectively govern ourselves, and we set a precedent that we expect to become the rule that we follow in the future. Fundamental Orders of Connecticut is the first self-authorized constitution. Now, again, I got a charter. It says land, says where I can go, who basically is in charge, but it doesn't give me the daily structure of how government works. We're going to create that on our own, right? Again, these all are firsts. They all set an example, and once the example's been set, I want you to think about how it affects you psychologically, right? If you remember in the past, I talked about these things as being privileges. These are not, when we think about unalienable rights, we think of them as God-given, nature-given, but sometimes how they surface and how we become aware and lay claim to them is just, getting away with it, like I said, all right? So here's my great example. Let's say, again, we're A block, and I'm not awake during A block. I'm not ready to get going. So I'm going to start every morning off while we wait for the announcements. You can bring in a reasonable cup of coffee and a reasonable snack. See these people having reasonable cups of coffee and snacks? And I'm going to allow that to happen for a couple of weeks. We go by a couple of weeks, and all of a sudden there's there's dark stains in the carpet. I know that this is, you can't get much worse than this color. It's not a color found in nature anywhere. But it's all of a sudden there's these mottled stains, and a lot of you use milk in your coffee, so it smells, just ghastly. Everything's sticky from the donuts, and I say, that's it, no more donuts. Huh. No more coffee. Huh. What happens when you've had a privilege that I've let you get away with for 2 weeks? I don't care if it's 2 days. Usually 2 days is all it takes. Well, let's call it 2 weeks. What happens to that privilege? How do you begin to see it? As a right. You all become Schmiegel. And it's my precious, right? Mine. You curl around this cup of coffee as if it's an infant son. Right? This infant son that I'm trying to tear from your hands. Nate is running down the hallways with this cup of coffee. He's got a 64-ounce cup of coffee. It's mine. He's running down the hallway with it. And you've annihilated the classroom because this is grounds for revolution. All right? If what you hear when you hear teachers drone on about the Mayflower Compact, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, and the House of Burgesses is Charlie Brown's teacher, remember why it's important. It's a first that sets an example that leads us all to be Schmiegel, leads us all to be Gollum here in claiming this, and it's my precious, and you can't take it. And if you do, I'm going to tear up the classroom. So why did we tear up the classroom? England is following salutary neglect. It's given us loose charters. It's let us get away with those democratic firsts. What changes things? What's the immediate trigger? What's the catalyst for the revolution? Back it up a little bit more. French and Indian War. The French and Indian War is what's going to lead to the taxes, and then we'll decode the taxes here in a second, right? The French and Indian War is the catalyst, because what happens is, by the way, the French and Indian War is an extension of what global war? 7 Years' War, right? Austria and Prussia, Prussia with a P, two Germanic powers get into a feud. Frederick II kind of like steals land from Austria left and right. And eventually they take offense, and this alliance system and this, rivalry within Europe drags everybody into a global war. So England jumps in, and because England jumps in, France jumps in, because England and France are historically kind of against each other. The North American theater of this war has nothing to do with that rivalry. It all has to do with land and both sides having expanded into the Ohio River Valley. France is up in Canada, and England is along the eastern seaboard, and we've both expanded into that Ohio River Valley, and we are itching for an excuse to figure out who has ultimate claim to the Americas. And the 7 Years' War is the excuse to have that fight. All right? So it is part of the larger war, but it's kind of fought for its own purposes, and it has its own, its own kind of place in history, I suppose. You almost think of it as a separate event, right? So this war, French and Indian War, is called that because we're naming for who we fought, the French colonists and their Native American allies. It is essentially kind of, we call it an English victory because, of what England walks away with. It's largely fought to a draw, but England gets a ton of concessions from France. Chiefly, we get all their North American holdings, right? We get India. We get a ton of land from it. But what I've always stressed is that this victory is not a victory. Anytime you fight a war, you have casualties in terms of people that die and the human cost, but what else is there? What do we know about war? Wars are expensive. So England essentially, doubles its debt in this war. It gets all this land. What's the problem with that? I thought all this new land would be great. What's the problem with that? You got to protect it. You've got to, I've got to draw, put roadways in and guard posts, and I've got to, build towns. And, I often equate it to, let's say you inherited Versailles. Oh boy, wouldn't you love that, 1,000-room mansion? And then you begin to think about just cleaning those 1,000 rooms alone, mowing the lawn. You have to get out there and trim the hedges, changing the beds and things like that. All this land is costly to administer. So the debt leads to what?
Taxes.
Taxes. And taxes lead to the revolution, correct? Yes?
Yes.
Taxes lead to the revolution. Wrong. So wrong, right? Why is it wrong? Why don't taxes lead to the revolution? Why don't taxes lead to the revolution? They always exist. You turn around and there is a tax. You're going to get a job, there's income tax. You buy a house, there's property tax. You get a car, there's excise tax. You go to the store, there's sales tax. You invest money and you make money, capital gains tax. You die and there's a death tax. There's literally a tax for everything. And if taxes are everywhere, then the entire world would be in revolution, right? You walk into the store and they do that 5% sales tax, and you go, revolution, and you start burning down the store, right? Taxes don't lead to the revolution. So what does? There's something wrong with the taxes. Yeah, both. We feel that there's something within the taxes that violate our rights. Now, we'll look a little more specifically at what those things are in a second. But one of the rights is this idea of representation, right? What's the classic line that you've been taught? Otis, no taxation without representation. That's wrong too. Here's the problem, all right? The taxes aren't the problem. The taxes have within them some pretty heavy-handed measures that are seen as violating our rights. So within the taxes are things that violate our rights. And two, we don't like how the taxes are arrived at. And what I mean is, we don't like who's gotten the final say about these taxes. The problem with no taxation without representation is it's a little misleading if you don't think about it critically enough. Do we have representation? Yeah. What is where are we represented? Parliament. Really what we are saying when we say no taxation without representation is we have the wrong kind of representations. We don't want Parliament making these decisions. Who do we want making these decisions? We do. We want our local assemblies. So what we really mean is no taxation without local representation. And if we're really being honest, what we just mean is no taxation. Because there is this idea of unbridled economic freedom in the colonies, where you should just be able to, that pursuit of happiness, you should be able to have limitless pursuit of commerce without any restrictions. So that idea gets a little muddled. To an English person, they'd look at it and they'd say, you do have representation, Parliament represents you, You might counter and say, well, I don't have a direct representative. They would counter and say, well, you have virtual representation. There's a lot of places in England that don't have direct representation. The way the body is set up is that any member of parliament represents England as a whole, just the way the president represents you. He is he's called chief citizen. He represents all people, not just people from his party, but everyone. Same thing with a member of parliament. You don't have to have somebody from Georgetown in parliament to have someone representing your interests. In addition, what if they did say, we'll give you direct representation in parliament? How many colonies? 13. How many do you want? You want 1, 2, 3 per colony? I don't care how many. The number would have to be pretty high to tip the ratio because parliament is made up of about 500 plus at this point. So let's give you 2. Let's give you 26 representatives. All right, you ready? All those in favor of taxing the hell out of the colonies, say aye. 500 big booming ayes. All those opposed, 36 timid little nays. And it is democratically decided. Can you complain? I mean, you can, but do you look like, you're sour grapes? Once something is democratically decided, can you complain? You had your say. It's democratic. All democracy is rule of law, or majority rule. So we don't really want representation in parliament. What we want is local representation. What we really want is no taxes, all right? And this is what sparks the revolution, right? You have taxed us through a body that we don't when we get to common sense, what you're going to see is that we're not thinking of ourselves as English anymore. We've kind of evolved into thinking about ourselves as different. And we want those local assemblies to have the authority to not tax us. And when you do tax us, it's seen as like this foreign interference, and we're going to resist it, and consequently, you're going to come down on us with these heavy-handed measures. And there maybe is some real violation. You're going to take away the right to trial by jury. You're going to take away the right to assembly. You're going to take away the right to, due process in the form of like privacy, right? So that's what I want you to look for. Now, I'm going to pause, if I can figure this out. And I'm going to pair you guys up real quickly. And I'm going to see how well you do this before I do a real quiz. I saw the faces, right? Can you remember these? Can you prove this to me? Can you show me that an act had a real violation in it? Right? That's what you're looking for. You want to try to remember what the act is, why the British passed it in the first place. Because if you're really being thinking about both sides of the coin, there's often legitimate motives here. And once you consider the British motives, consider the colonist motives and say, well, are they justified? Is this a violation of those cornerstones established throughout history as a God-given, kind of nature-given birthright, right? So let me pause.